What the hell was sitting on my land when I came home? I stood at the fence line staring at a fresh, private runway carved through my wheat, like a surgical incision meant to kill something that had been alive for generations. $1 million jet rolled forward, engines humming with ownership, as if the soil beneath it had always belonged to them. I had been gone 3 months. 3 months spent sleeping in hospital chairs in Houston, while my father fought for breaths that kept slipping away. I came back expecting quiet, and found aviation lights blinking where crops used to bow. The Willowbrook HOA hadn't asked, hadn't warned, and hadn't waited. They had already decided. HOA Karen stood halfway down the jet stairs in a white designer dress, smiling like the land itself had invited her. She lifted a hand and waved, casual, satisfied, untouchable. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? Her smile didn't carry surprise or apology, only the calm of someone who believed the fight was already over. "Welcome back," she called across the runway. Her voice floating over asphalt poured where my grandfather's boots once sank into soil. "I hope you don't mind," she added, tilting her head as if this were a minor inconvenience and not a declaration of war. "We finished the community improvement project while you were away handling family matters." Family matters, she called it, as if watching a man die slowly in a hospital room was a scheduling conflict. I looked past her at the lights, the markings, the jet fuel staining the air. They had paved over my wheat, my corn, my irrigation lines, my history. This wasn't an encroachment or a mistake. This was possession. I opened my mouth to speak and found nothing polite worth saying. "This is my land," I said finally, the words sounding small against the engines. HOA Karen's smile sharpened. "Was," she corrected gently, already turning back toward the aircraft. "Check your mailbox," she added without looking at. "Everything's legal." The jet engines roared louder, swallowing the conversation, and she disappeared inside like a queen, retreating from conquered ground. The plane rolled forward, lifted, and tore a scar into the sky above property that had fed my family for 80 years. I stood there alone, wind carrying the smell of aviation fuel across a field that should have smelled like earth. Shock didn't come as panic or disbelief. It came as a cold, hollow understanding that whatever this was, it had been planned carefully and executed without hesitation. I walked to the old mailbox at the end of the drive. Inside were documents stacked neatly, clipped, tabbed, highlighted. Emergency condemnation, public safety designation, temporary seizure with permanent implications, compensation deposited with the county court. Every page was clean, precise, and ruthless. They hadn't broken the law in the messy way desperate people do. They had weaponized it. 3 months earlier, I had left this place intact. 200 acres of working farmland purchased by my grandfather in 1943 with money he earned, breaking his back and refusing to quit. Land that had fed 3 generations, paid college tuition, kept roofs overhead, and survived droughts, floods, and recessions. I left thinking I would come back to harvest. Instead, I came back to a runway. My name is Marcus Delqua. Monday through Friday, I serve as a regional director for the Federal Aviation Administration in the Southwest Division. From a windowless office in Dallas, I oversee air traffic policy, compliance, and enforcement across multiple states. Every aircraft operation in my region touches systems I manage. Every permit, every registration, every flight plan exists inside databases I am responsible for maintaining. On weekends, I am something else entirely. I am a farmer. I am a steward of land my grandfather trusted me to protect. I grew up learning the difference between soil that's alive and dirt that's been killed by neglect. I learned patience from seasons and responsibility from inheritance. That dual existence is what HOA Karen failed to understand standing on those jet stairs. Willowbrook Estates didn't appear overnight. For years, the development crept closer, polite at first, respectful on the surface. The HOA marketed our farm as a feature, not a nuisance. They printed brochures bragging about authentic rural charm. Prospective buyers were walked past our fields like museum exhibits. They waved at us during harvest festivals and bought organic corn for dinner parties. Property values climbed, and nobody complained as long as the farm stayed picturesque and compliant. That balance collapsed the moment HOA Karen took control. She didn't see land as something to preserve or coexist with. She saw it as underutilized space. To her, wheat was wasted potential, and soil was a temporary inconvenience. She spoke the language of progress, but her eyes tracked profit. I remembered the last conversation we had before I left for Houston. She stood at the edge of the eastern field, heels sinking slightly into mud she pretended not to notice. "That strip would make a stunning community asset," she said, gesturing across rows my father had planted by hand. "It grows food," I replied, wiping dirt from my palms. Her smile never reached her eyes. "Progress requires sacrifice," she said, like she was quoting scripture. Then my father got sick. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The kind that doesn't negotiate or slow down. I packed a bag and drove to Houston without thinking about HOA meetings or zoning disputes. Hospitals replace time with beeping machines and fluorescent nights. Days blur together, and the world outside shrinks to the size of a bedside chair. That's when HOA Karen moved. 2 weeks after I left, she called an emergency HOA session. She claimed my irrigation system posed a flooding risk to community foundations. She waved reports, maps, and signatures. Neighbors were scared, banks were cooperative, and county officials were conveniently compliant. Emergency powers gave them speed. Speed denied me a chance to respond. By the time my phone rang with fragmented warnings, the process was already underway. Construction crews arrived while I sat watching my father sleep. Asphalt replaced wheat while I memorized hospital corridors. By the time he died, the runway lights were already installed. He asked me about the fall harvest the night before he passed. I told him everything was fine. I lied because the truth would have broken him faster than the cancer. Standing on that runway, paperwork in my hands, I understood the depth of the insult. This wasn't just theft. It was humiliation delivered through procedure. HOA Karen hadn't shouted or threatened. She had smiled, filed forms, and erased a legacy while I was busy keeping a promise to my dying father. Shock gave way to something steadier, not rage that burns hot and fades. Something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. HOA. Karen believed she had already won. She believed a grieving farmer would read those papers, realize the cost of fighting, and surrender quietly. She believed her authority was absolute because it had not yet been challenged. Standing there with jet fuel in the air and soil under cracked asphalt, I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to plead or negotiate. I was going to let her believe the runway was hers. Because the moment she turned my land into an airport, she stepped into my world. Authority is a strange thing when you live with it long enough. It stops feeling like power and starts feeling like responsibility, something heavy you carry whether you want to or not. I didn't grow up dreaming about government titles or federal badges. I grew up measuring seasons by soil moisture and crop rotation, learning that mistakes don't apologize, and land remembers everything you do to it. My grandfather bought this farm in 1943, with money he earned doing work that bent his spine and hardened his hands. He didn't inherit it, didn't speculate on it, didn't flip it for profit. He committed to it. He believed land was something you earned the right to keep by taking care of it every day, even when nobody was watching. That belief was passed down the same way his tools were passed down, worn, unpolished, and expected to work. My father expanded the operation in the 70s when farming stopped being romantic and started being brutal. He learned contracts, supply chains, and margins because loving the land wasn't enough to keep it alive anymore. He built relationships with restaurants, markets, distributors, and neighbors. He taught me that survival meant understanding systems, not just weather. Watching him navigate that balance planted something in me long before I ever stepped into a federal office. He understood leverage without calling it that. He understood rules without needing to write them down. That mindset followed me when I left for college and then into public service. When I joined the FAA, it wasn't because I loved bureaucracy. It was because aviation is built on rules that exist to prevent catastrophe. There is no room for improvisation when metal is moving through the sky at hundreds of miles an hour. Compliance isn't optional, and authority isn't symbolic. It's enforced or people die. Over the years, I moved into roles that required less visibility and more control. systems oversight, regulatory enforcement, database governance, the unglamorous backbone of aviation safety. I became the person other people didn't notice until something went wrong. And when it did, I was the one expected to fix it quietly and completely. That work trained me to think in layers. Surface narratives never tell the truth. Paper trails matter more than speeches. Power rarely announces itself loudly. It files motions, submits applications, and waits for silence. By the time I became a regional director, I understood that authority doesn't come from shouting orders. It comes from knowing exactly where to apply pressure, so outcomes become unavoidable. That understanding didn't make me arrogant. It made me careful, because authority misused is indistinguishable from abuse once the damage is done. On weekends, I came home to the farm and left that world behind. Or at least I thought I did. The truth is, the two halves of my life were always closer than I admitted. Farming teaches patience. Federal enforcement demands it. Farming punishes shortcuts. Aviation regulations exist because shortcuts kill. The difference is that on the farm, consequences grow slowly and visibly. In government, they move through channels most people never see until it's too late. Willowbrook Estates grew alongside that blind spot. At first, it felt benign. Families moved in. Kids waved as tractors passed. The HOA invited us to meetings as a courtesy, not a threat. They liked the farm, as long as it stayed useful to their image. We were authenticity without inconvenience, a backdrop that boosted property values while remaining conveniently silent. I watched it happen, and didn't object because coexistence seemed possible. I believed in boundaries. I believed respect could be maintained if everyone benefited. That belief died the moment HOA Karen took over. She didn't grow up with land. She grew up with contracts. Her family built strip malls, parking lots, and developments designed to extract value quickly and move on. To her, permanence was inefficiency. She didn't see history when she looked at the fields. She saw an obstacle delaying returns. When she talked about progress, she meant monetization. When she talked about community, she meant control. She was careful at first. Compliments, suggestions, exploratory conversations. She floated ideas the way predators test fences, recreation areas, shared amenities, infrastructure improvements. I shut them down politely, thinking politeness was enough. I underestimated how deeply she believed that resistance was temporary. In her world, everything eventually folded if you applied enough pressure in the right places. My father's illness gave her those places. Distance, distraction, grief. She didn't have to overpower me. She only had to move faster than I could respond. Emergency powers exist for floods and fires, not ambition. But ambition wears the same uniform if nobody stops it. By the time I understood how far she had gone, the authority she wielded looked legitimate on paper. That's the danger of systems built on trust. Once someone learns how to mimic compliance, they can do enormous damage before anyone notices. What HOA Karen never understood was that my authority didn't end at my property line. She thought of me as a farmer first and a bureaucrat second. She assumed my federal role made me cautious, boxed in, politically vulnerable. She believed that threatening my career would paralyze me. What she failed to grasp was that my career existed because I knew how to dismantle illegal operations quietly and completely. The moment she built a runway, she didn't just steal land. She triggered oversight mechanisms she didn't even know existed. I didn't confront her after that first day. I didn't argue or threaten. Authority doesn't reveal itself prematurely. It documents. It waits. It lets violations accumulate until defense becomes impossible. While she celebrated what she thought was a finished conquest, I began seeing her operation the way I see unsafe airspace, not as a personal insult, but as a systemic failure that needed to be corrected before it spread. The farm had taught me to protect what matters patiently. The FAA had taught me how to end things permanently when patience ran out. Power doesn't usually arrive with force. It arrives with meetings, agendas, and people who know how to smile while they tighten a noose. HOA Karen didn't seize control by shouting or threatening. She did it by reorganizing committees, consolidating votes, and rewriting bylaws in language most residents never read. She learned quickly which neighbors were afraid of rising taxes, which ones were leveraged with mortgages they couldn't afford to lose, and which local officials preferred convenience over scrutiny. Every decision she made looked reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a machine designed to move property without ever calling it theft. The HOA's authority expanded the way mold spreads, quietly and persistently, feeding on apathy and fear. Emergency provisions were broadened under the banner of community safety. Architectural committees were replaced with compliance boards. Fines increased. Enforcement became selective. If you supported her, violations disappeared. If you questioned her, inspections multiplied. The HOA stopped being a neighborhood association and became a private enforcement arm that answered to one woman's financial vision. Residents didn't revolt because each pressure point was applied individually, never enough to trigger collective resistance. When HOA Karen targeted my land, she didn't start with bulldozers. She started with paperwork. She filed complaints about irrigation runoff, knowing county inspectors were understaffed and overworked. She framed decades-old systems as new risks. She presented appraisals prepared by consultants who had already decided the outcome before setting foot on the property. By the time any official questioned the logic, the narrative had already been established. Urgent action was required, and delay would endanger the community. Emergency powers turned speed into legitimacy. Speed turned theft into fait accompli. The abuse radiated outward. Banks that had financed my equipment for decades suddenly froze credit lines, citing policy reviews that coincidentally aligned with HOA filings. Farm workers were told their services were no longer required because the land was being transitioned. Neighbors who had shared meals with my family for years received warnings about zoning compliance and tax reassessments if they opposed the condemnation. Nobody was threatened directly. They were reminded of consequences. HOA Karen didn't need to yell. She only needed to make examples quietly. Grief became her greatest ally. While I was in Houston, unreachable and distracted, she exploited the silence. She scheduled meetings with minimal notice. She recorded votes with barely enough quorum to claim legitimacy. She relied on the assumption that a grieving son wouldn't have the energy or resources to fight a process already moving at full speed. And she was right about one thing. I didn't have the capacity to stop her in real time. What she misunderstood was the cost of overconfidence once the victim returns with clarity. By the time I came home, the abuse had matured into infrastructure. Construction contracts were signed, security fences erected, access roads graded. Each step locked the previous one in place. That's how abusive systems protect themselves. They make reversal expensive, complicated, and politically inconvenient. They dare you to fight by raising the stakes until surrender looks rational. HOA Karen believed she had insulated herself behind layers of legality and community approval. She believed that even if I protested, I would be framed as emotional, unreasonable, and isolated. What she didn't account for was how transparent abuse looks when you understand systems. Emergency condemnations leave trails. Financial coercion leaves patterns. Selective enforcement creates statistical anomalies that are impossible to hide from anyone who knows where to look. The HOA's power structure wasn't just abusive, it was sloppy in its arrogance. They assumed farmers didn't read fine print. They assumed neighbors wouldn't talk. They assumed no one would connect the dots between pressure campaigns and profit motives. HOA Karen's greatest mistake was centralizing everything through herself. Every intimidation route, every legal maneuver, every payoff flowed through one office, one email chain, one signature authority. That concentration made her feel powerful. It also made her exposed. She liked control too much to delegate. She trusted her instincts more than safeguards. She believed fear would keep everyone silent indefinitely. Fear works until it doesn't. And once people realize silence no longer protects them, they start recording, documenting, and talking. The abuse reached a point where it stopped being personal and became structural corruption. County officials deferred without review. Appraisers repeated valuations that contradicted market reality. Law firms represented multiple parties in transactions that should have triggered conflict of interest alarms. None of it was hidden. It was normalized. That's how systems rot. They stop questioning themselves because questioning slows things down. Standing in the shadow of a runway built on coerced consent, I understood something fundamental. HOA Karen wasn't powerful because she was right. She was powerful because nobody had forced her to justify herself yet. Her authority existed in the absence of challenge, and the moment it faced sustained scrutiny, it would collapse under its own contradictions. The abuse wasn't just wrong, it was unsustainable. All it needed was someone patient enough to let it expose itself completely. The shift from reaction to investigation happened quietly, without ceremony or announcement, the way serious work always does. I didn't storm into offices or demand explanations. I didn't confront HOA Karen or warn her that she had gone too far. Warnings change behavior, and I needed her comfortable, confident, and careless. Instead, I started documenting. I treated the runway the way I would treat an unregulated airspace anomaly, something you observe patiently until the pattern reveals itself. Every violation tells a story if you let it finish speaking. The first step was legal insulation. I hired Rebecca Martinez out of Austin, not because she was loud or theatrical, but because she was methodical and merciless with paper trails. She had dismantled land grabs before, and she understood how developers weaponize emergency powers. When she spread the HOA documents across my kitchen table, she didn't sound angry or impressed. She sounded amused. She pointed out missing notices, contradictory valuations, and emergency justifications that didn't survive basic scrutiny. She didn't promise a quick victory. She promised leverage if I was patient. While she began constructing the legal framework, I built the factual one. I installed trail cameras along the property lines under the pretense of monitoring remaining agricultural equipment. I positioned them the way I'd learned to position sensors near restricted runways, angled to capture movement without advertising their presence. Then I added audio pickups calibrated for distance, not volume. I wasn't interested in gossip. I was interested in intent. Words spoken casually reveal more than statements made under pressure. What I saw in the first weeks reframed everything. This wasn't a private convenience strip for occasional hobby flights. This was a functioning aviation operation. Jets arrived on predictable schedules. Passenger vehicles queued at the edge of the runway. Wine crates and catering trucks appeared on weekends. HOA Karen hosted what she called community events, but the guests weren't neighbors. They were executives, investors, and people who moved through the world assuming access was their birthright. The runway wasn't incidental. It was the product. The brochures confirmed it. Glossy, professionally printed materials advertising exclusive charter access, discreet travel, and premium storage, monthly aircraft fees, initiation costs, and destination lists that crossed state lines. None of it was registered. None of it was permitted. None of it could exist legally under the designations they had claimed. I cross-referenced tail numbers through internal systems I knew as well as my own name. Patterns emerged immediately. Repeated flights, consistent passenger loads, revenue-generating behavior disguised as private use. Then the recording started paying dividends. HOA Karen didn't whisper when she felt secure. She bragged. She talked about timing, about hospital visits, about how unreachable windows made everything easier. She laughed about how nobody questions emergency actions when grief is involved. On one recording, a county commissioner joked that cancer had been a gift to their schedule. That sentence sat heavy in my chest, not because it shocked me, but because it clarified the moral vacuum I was dealing with. Financial records followed. Rebecca used discovery motions to pry loose HOA ledgers, consulting invoices, and payment authorizations. $500,000 labeled as emergency runway consulting jumped off the page. The recipient was Federal Aviation Consulting, a name I recognized instantly from internal databases. Lonier wasn't independent. It was owned by the same law firm representing HOA Karen. Aircraft registrations filed months before my father's diagnosis matched board members who claimed ignorance. The timeline was too clean to be accidental. Every new document made the picture uglier and more complete. This wasn't opportunism, it was orchestration. They had planned the seizure months in advance. anticipating my absence and accelerating construction to lock in jurisdictional complexity. They had counted on me being isolated, emotionally compromised, and financially pressured into surrender. They had not counted on me understanding aviation compliance better than anyone in the room. The more I documented, the more confident HOA Karen became. Flights increased, fees went up, conversations grew sloppier. She talked openly about expansion, about commercial certification, about friends in Federal Aviation who would smooth the process. That phrase made me stop and listen harder. Friends in Federal Aviation meant influence, not authority. Influence leaves fingerprints. Authority leaves records. I knew which one scared me more. I spent nights cross-referencing personnel rosters, political donations, and consulting disclosures. The trail led upward, exactly where I expected it to. Deputy Administrator Blackwood sat high enough to be dangerous and far enough removed to believe himself untouchable. Consulting fees flowed through shell entities that complied just enough to avoid casual detection. Every interaction violated conflict rules that exist precisely to prevent this kind of abuse. They weren't careful because they didn't believe anyone was watching. By the time I finished compiling the evidence, the story was undeniable. HOA Karen hadn't just stolen my land. She had constructed an illegal commercial aviation hub, laundered money through shell companies, coerced community compliance, and colluded with federal officials to neutralize oversight. It was bigger than restitution. It was criminal. And the best part was that she was still building it, still expanding, still documenting her own guilt every time a jet touched down. All I had to do was let her finish. HOA. Karen didn't retreat when pressure built. She escalated, because people like her mistake motion for momentum and noise for dominance. The closer the evidence closed in, the louder and more public she became. Convinced visibility would turn legitimacy into armor. She announced a grand unveiling for the runway, a community celebration meant to cement what she had already stolen. Invitations went out to investors, politicians, and regional power brokers. The message was clear. This wasn't a secret anymore. This was success, and success demands witnesses. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn anyone. I watched. I documented. Every jet that landed added weight to a case already bending under its own mass. Tail numbers stacked like charges. Passenger manifests read like indictments. Unregistered commercial operations disguised as private convenience crossed state lines without permits, without customs declarations, without oversight. Each violation was clean, time-stamped, and indisputable. She believed the spectacle would intimidate me into silence. She didn't understand that spectacle is exactly what federal enforcement needs when it's time to end something permanently. The days leading up to the event felt eerily calm. Construction crews finished temporary terminals where crops once grew. Catering trucks rehearsed routes. Media coordinators tested camera angles. HOA Karen walked the grounds like a general inspecting conquered territory, heels clicking against asphalt poured over my family's history. She smiled more than usual. Confidence radiated from her because she believed she had crossed the threshold where consequences stop applying. On the morning of the celebration, the sky was clear in that way that makes people believe nothing bad can happen. Jets arrived in steady intervals, engines screaming entitlement across land that had never consented. Guests stepped onto the runway laughing, shaking hands, congratulating one another for progress they didn't question. Political aides mingled with executives. Cameras rolled. Everything about the scene was designed to normalize the crime by wrapping it in ceremony. I stayed out of sight, watching through feeds that captured every angle. Federal systems lit up quietly as violations registered automatically. I could see the pattern forming in real time, a cascade of alerts triggered by operations that should never have existed. The beauty of regulation is that it doesn't care how confident you look when you break it. It only cares that you did. The moment that confirmed everything came late in the morning. A black limousine pulled up, and Deputy Administrator Blackwood stepped out into the sun like he belonged there. HOA Karen greeted him with familiarity that left no room for doubt. Their conversation was picked up clearly by the microphones I had placed weeks earlier. Termination paperwork, effective dates, and contingency plans were discussed with casual cruelty. They spoke about my career like it was already a closed file. They spoke about my death like it was an inconvenience to be scheduled. Every word was recorded. Every syllable crossed from corruption into conspiracy. They believed proximity equaled safety. They believed authority was transferable by association. They were wrong. The ceremony began shortly after. HOA Karen took the podium where wheat once grew and spoke about progress, community, and economic development. Applause followed because applause is easy when you don't pay the cost. A congressman praised public-private partnerships. A county official thanked leadership. Then Blackwood stepped forward and made the mistake that ended everything. He announced federal certification for commercial operations that had never been granted. He spoke fraud into existence in front of cameras, witnesses, and federal systems that record lies the same way they record truth. That was enough. I stepped forward into the open, walking toward the crowd that had already decided I was finished. Faces turned. Whispers spread. HOA Karen saw me and lost color instantly. She hadn't expected me there. She hadn't expected confidence. She hadn't expected silence. I introduced myself calmly and thanked everyone for gathering to document the largest aviation crime scene in the region's history. The runway went quiet, in a way I will never forget. Then the sky changed. Federal helicopters cut through the air, rotors drowning out confusion. Agents descended with precision that left no room for escape. Sirens replaced applause. Politicians scattered. Executives froze. The spectacle HOA Karen had built collapsed into chaos in seconds. Handcuffs clicked, jets were chained, assets were seized where they sat. Authority reasserted itself without raising its voice. HOA Karen screamed about rights and persecution as agents took her arms. Her words didn't matter anymore. Systems had already decided. Blackwood was restrained face down on asphalt he thought belonged to him. Cameras captured everything, not because I wanted humiliation, but because transparency is what ends denial. By the time the sun dipped, the runway was no longer a symbol of power. It was evidence. And the woman who believed she owned the outcome stood silent, finally understanding that spectacle cuts both ways. The collapse was loud, but the retaliation was quiet, procedural, and irreversible. Once the spectacle ended and the cameras stopped chasing chaos, the work shifted back into rooms without windows, where consequences are decided by records rather than reactions. That was where I was most comfortable. HOA Karen's authority evaporated the moment the first arrest report was filed, but the dismantling of her operation didn't rely on outrage or public opinion. It relied on compliance reviews, enforcement triggers, and statutory mandates that do not care who you once intimidated. Federal agencies moved with the kind of coordination that only happens when evidence is overwhelming and jurisdiction is clear. Aviation enforcement teams sealed the runway as an active crime scene. Environmental regulators assessed contamination from improperly stored fuel and unpermitted runoff. Financial crimes units froze accounts connected to shell companies within hours, preventing a single dollar from disappearing offshore. The IRS followed money trails that had been hidden in plain sight, reconstructing years of laundering disguised as community development expenses. Nothing was rushed. Every step was deliberate, because speed is unnecessary when outcomes are guaranteed. HOA Karen attempted to regain control through lawyers, statements, and procedural objections, but the systems she had abused now worked against her. Emergency powers don't protect criminal enterprises. Community boards don't override federal aviation law. Political favors don't survive documented bribery. Every attempt she made to assert influence only added weight to the case against her. The more she spoke, the more transcripts filled with contradictions. Silence would have helped her. She couldn't tolerate it. The retaliation wasn't personal. That distinction mattered. I didn't direct it. I didn't need to. The framework I had documented activated enforcement mechanisms designed to respond exactly to this kind of violation. Aviation law doesn't negotiate. Financial compliance doesn't empathize. Environmental statutes don't forgive intent. Once triggered, they proceed until resolved. And resolution, in this case, meant dismantling everything she had built. Court orders came down methodically. Injunctions halted all operations. Asset seizure warrants were executed without ceremony. Aircraft that had symbolized wealth and access were towed away as evidence, stripped of their status, and reduced to inventory numbers. Contracts were voided. Permits were rescinded. Corporate registrations were suspended. The illusion of legitimacy disintegrated piece by piece, not with drama, but with finality. The HOA itself became a liability overnight. Board members resigned or invoked the Fifth Amendment. Insurance carriers withdrew coverage. Banks demanded immediate repayment on loans secured by fraudulent valuations. Residents who had once voted in favor of improvements now faced assessments tied to criminal debt. The association that had bullied its way into power found itself unable to pay for legal defense, let alone influence outcomes. Dissolution wasn't a decision, it was an inevitability. HOA Karen's professional network collapsed faster than she expected. Consultants distanced themselves. Political allies issued statements claiming ignorance. The law firm that had facilitated the scheme was disbarred from representing any party connected to the case. Careers ended quietly. Titles vanished from letterheads. The retaliation spread not because anyone wanted revenge, but because corruption requires complicity, and complicity leaves records. My role during this phase was minimal and precise. I answered questions. I authenticated data. I verified compliance histories. I didn't gloat or grandstand. Experts don't need to. Authority expresses itself through restraint. Every time someone tried to frame the outcome as personal vengeance, the documentation shut that narrative down. This wasn't retaliation for theft. It was enforcement of law against sustained, deliberate criminal activity. The most effective retaliation was time. Weeks passed, then months. Court dates stacked. Motions failed. Appeals stalled. Each delay only extended the period in which HOA Karen sat without leverage, without allies, without the ability to influence anything. Power depends on options. She had none left. Her operation wasn't just stopped, it was unwound backward, transaction by transaction, until nothing remained that could be salvaged or rebranded. The land returned through injunction, not apology. Titles were restored through orders, not negotiations. Protections were layered to prevent future abuse. Zoning classifications locked permanently into agricultural status, with federal oversight attached. The systems that had failed initially were corrected with safeguards that made repetition impossible. Retaliation isn't about punishment. It's about ensuring the same violation can never occur again. HOA Karen learned too late that the expertise doesn't need to announce itself. It waits, documents, and acts when exposure guarantees compliance. She had mistaken intimidation for permanence and visibility for protection. In the end, she wasn't defeated by anger or confrontation. She was neutralized by professionals doing exactly what their systems were designed to do once someone pushed them far enough. The land came back without fanfare, the way things do when courts correct errors rather than celebrate wins. There was no ceremony, no press conference, no apology delivered with a microphone. A judge signed an order. Titles reverted. Jurisdiction locked. Agricultural protections reinstated with language so tight, it left no room for reinterpretation. The runway didn't get demolished in anger. It was dismantled like a mistake, asphalt peeled back and hauled away in pieces that never explained themselves. What had once been loud became unremarkable, and that was the point. By the time the final equipment was removed, the field looked scarred but honest. Soil exposed to air again. Irrigation lines repaired. The land didn't rush to forgive. It took seasons to settle, to relearn its shape, to remember what it was supposed to do. I didn't hurry it. Farming teaches you that forcing recovery only causes new damage. I planted slowly, deliberately, choosing crops my grandfather trusted because they survived disruption without pretending it didn't happen. HOA Karen disappeared from relevance long before sentencing concluded. Once authority leaves someone, interest follows. Court documents replaced gossip. Case numbers replaced names. She became a file, then a statistic, then an absence. Her voice, once confident enough to declare ownership over other people's lives, stopped carrying. Silence took her place, and nothing rushed to fill it. The association she built dissolved without a vote. It didn't need one. Financial obligations exceeded assets. Legal exposure exceeded insurance. Residents who had once deferred to her stopped answering calls. Signs came down. Letterheads vanished. What remained was paperwork and liability, neither of which responds to intimidation. The neighborhood adjusted. People adapted. They always do when control gives way to structure. I didn't stand on the field and feel triumphant. Triumph implies emotion, and emotion wasn't what finished this. Precision did. Process did. Patience did. The satisfaction came from knowing there was nothing left to argue about. No appeals pending, no loopholes unexamined, no influence left unaccounted for. Closure isn't loud when it's real. The first harvest after restoration was modest. That was expected. Land doesn't rebound just because the threat is gone. It rebuilds the way people do, cautiously and without trust. I walked the rows alone most mornings, checking soil, listening to birds return where engines once screamed. The contrast didn't make me smile. It made sense. Order had been restored, not celebrated. Occasionally someone would ask if it felt good to win. I never answered directly. Winning suggests competition. This wasn't a contest. It was a correction. Something was wrong, and it was fixed using the tools designed to fix it. Anything more than that cheapens the outcome. The system worked because it was forced to confront its own abuse. That's not victory. That's maintenance. HOA Karen never spoke to me again. There was nothing left to say. Her name stopped appearing in documents. Her influence stopped shaping decisions. Her certainty evaporated, and the world moved on without needing her permission. That is the coldest ending there is. Not punishment, not humiliation, irrelevance. The land stayed. That was enough.